Hello everyone and welcome to the RAF Museum's Research Lectures. I'm Dr. Harry Rafal, the Museum's historian, and tonight's lecture is on the RAF's Caribbean and West African aircrew volunteers in the Second World War. Can I first say a warm welcome to all of you joining us from around the world, and tonight we have people joining us from Barbados, California, and even Downham Market. So wherever you're joining us from, welcome. And on behalf of you all, let me offer you a welcome to Mark Johnson, our speaker tonight. Mark is a former military officer with operational experience against the drug cartels in the Caribbean and Central Americans. Mark's great uncle was Flight Lieutenant John J. Blair, DFC, who served a full tour in Bomber Command between 1944 and 1945 and subsequently transferred to the Pathfinder Force. And I would highly recommend Mark's book. He's the author of Caribbean Volunteers at War, and it's based on a substantial amount of original research and oral histories. So without any further ado, I'm going to bring Mark onto the stage. So, turn the video on. Sorry, Mark, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Good. I'm trying to turn your video on, but not having time and success. Mark, what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove you from the feed and then add you back on. If you remember, I briefly discussed that. That might mean we also leave lose your screen, so we'll have to reshare that. But we'll get you back on quickly. Okay. So apologies, everyone. A small delay, and get Mark back. Onto the screen. Okay, and whilst we're waiting for Mark to rejoin it gives me an opportunity to plug his book. There you are, Mark. You're back with us. Excellent. Okay, so if you can share your screen as well, then we'll get going. And as I was saying, as you do that, it gives me an opportunity to really plug your book. It's a fantastic read, very informative and insightful, and I'm going to post the link later on. But all right, Mark, I'm going to let you get on with your talk now.
Thank you very much, Harry, and hello, everyone. I'm really delighted there are so many people on this session. I didn't expect that sort of number, 239. So I'm going to start by going just slightly off script, and I'm motivated or prompted to do that by two things. One is a comment apparently made by a prominent historian today about the relevance, or in his opinion, the irrelevance of Black history. I think he said, I think Harry's telling me, he said, we should be focusing on real history. Okay, so I'm going to deal with that. And someone in the feed asked the question, which I am going to deal with during the session, but I want to start by addressing that question. And that's what was the motivation of men and women from the Caribbean in the time of colonialism to come and fight, essentially, these are my words now, to come and fight for the colonial master. So I'm going to address that before we get started, because I know that's a question that occurs to a lot of people. So it's probably useful to cover it. And we will return to it. I'll talk about motivation later. So let's deal with the relevance of Black history. Why is Black history worth spending time on? So my response to that is, first of all history is important. We've all contributed to the global progress of humanity and in various ways, and we need to understand all dimensions of that, regardless of race and creed. And so history is history, and there's no piece of history that's less important than any other piece. So that's one response. But in terms of Britain today, I think what my presentation is intended to address really is the contribution made to Britain's survival, and it's one facet of a much wider contribution made to Britain in general by immigrants of all kinds, not just Black immigrants. And it's very difficult to claim your place in a society to be considered as anything other than, a tolerated guest or a victim fleeing persecution, unless you can ensure that people understand the other things that you've done, that your people have done. And so, although this story doesn't necessarily inspire all Black people, so Black people don't like the story, some of them find it very inspiring, but there is a mixed perspective. Although it doesn't inspire everybody, I think that's a shame, because I think it's a real opportunity to say to those who question our presence here that we haven't just worked for it, we've also fought for it. and we shed our blood for it. And so that's why I focus on this particular tale. So in terms of motivation for volunteering, I'm going to come back to that in a little bit, in a little time, in a few more slides, and talk about that in more depth. Okay? But that's my preamble. So let's get into the topic, and we're focusing on both men and women of African descent. So although Caribbean represents the largest slice in terms of the Royal Air Force and aircrew, people who were actually flying, there are a lot of West Africans involved, and I'm going to focus on a couple of them. And we'll actually come a little bit out of the RAF history as well, and talk briefly about other aspects of the conflict and the contribution made there, and again, motivation. Now, a lot of people don't realize they may be aware of the involvement of black aircrew during the Second World War. A lot of people don't realize that there were actually black airmen flying during the First World War. And interestingly, they were on both sides of the conflict. So probably almost certainly the first black airman in history, contrary to certain articles online, was actually a Turkish flyer. So he was a fighter pilot, Ahmet Ali Jeliktin. I'm probably going to be corrected on my pronunciation. I don't speak Turkish. But he flew for the Ottoman Empire. His mother was of Nigerian descent, and his father was Afro-Turkish, so half Nigerian and half Turkish. And you can see the photograph on the right, and you can see in this group photograph how he's been left in the background. And you could say that was accidental, but as we go through, or certainly as I went through the archive photographs, it wasn't unusual to see the black flyer off to one side or left in the background. It's quite a common theme. So there were obviously still issues. But he prospered, he survived the war, he continued flying for many years after the war as a commercial pilot, and very, very highly respected in the main, and a very successful pilot. So that's our first member of black aircrew, and he's flying. If you think about the invention of the aircraft not many years before, we have black people flying aircraft almost as soon as aircraft had been invented. The first black American fighter pilot, who is often credited with being the first black fighter pilot, but was not the first, is Eugene Bullard. Very interesting person. And as you'll see, Eugene Bullard is going to span both the military dimension, fighting for the empire, and the civil rights dimension, because he was a very active member of the civil rights movement in the United States. In fact, he left the United States because of racism, and he moved first to Scotland and then to France. He was a boxer and a musician, a jazz musician. And then during the First World War, he ended up flying with the French. But before he flew with the French, he fought as a member of the French Foreign Legion. The reason he was in the Foreign Legion, of course, was that you couldn't join the French army as a foreigner, but you could join the Foreign Legion from anywhere. So he joined the Foreign Legion. He fought in the Battle of the Somme, in Champagne, at Verdun, a terrible, terrible battle, if you know your First World War history, one of the worst battles in history, where he was severely wounded. He recovered, and he then joined 269 American volunteers, almost all white except for him, who were forming a squadron called the Lafayette Flying Corps, or a unit called the Lafayette Flying Corps. He joined in 1916, and he flew for them very successfully, won medals. He won the Legion of Honor, the Knight. There are different levels to that medal, but he won his Knight of the Legion of Honor, one of the highest French awards. And he shot down reportedly 2 German aircraft. Then he returned to the States, and in 1949, this is after the Second World War, he was attending a civil rights sponsored concert in a concert hall in New York. And on leaving, there were activists, white activists, and police officers outside. But both groups, the activists and the police officers, charged the people leaving the concert peacefully and beat them viciously. 13 people were badly injured, including Eugene, who was severely hurt. He did live, though, till 1961, but very active in civil rights, and paid the price for that as well. So it's not about people who are somehow subservient, who are somehow in service of a white master. That's not what's happening here. These are people who are, I was going to say warlike, they're not warlike, they're strong, they're militant, they're determined to fight, whether they're fighting foreign aggressor or they're fighting for their own rights. And this is a characteristic that you'll see is common to all of them as we go through some of these stories. Alexander Patterson. Now, I didn't know about Alexander until quite recently, when his grandson, I apologize if I've got that wrong, his grandson sent me some information. Very, very interesting man. So he was born in Southampton in 1892. He was the son of a mariner, so that's his father on the right, who was a sailor, and a British nurse. So it's a mixed race relationship. And again, we have this sense that that didn't happen much. That was actually quite common. Lots of mixed race people in Britain at that time, and we'll see a few more later. And you can see under the red arrow here, that's Alexander as part of his unit. At that point in time, he's not in the air, he's a mechanical draftsman for the Royal Flying Corps. But he then qualifies as a pilot. Before that happens, he's awarded the Mons Star for his participation in that battle. And in 1915, he becomes a sergeant, he gains his wings, and later a sergeant major, and he rises to the rank of officer. I think it was a flight lieutenant at the end, or equivalent. The names of the ranks change over time in 1917. Now, again, in fact, I've cropped this image because I wanted to get him as large as we could, because it's a small image. But there are actually four other white airmen standing on the other side of this officer, very close to the officer, and then there's this gap of almost 2 feet, and then there's Patterson there. So that's again a theme. But despite that, there he is. He's in his uniform. He's flying an aircraft. He's doing what he wanted to do, and he's fighting the fight that he wanted to fight. Not forced to go. This is a voluntary service. The Royal Flying Corps. You're not conscripted into the Royal Flying Corps. Many other stories that are forgotten. We haven't been able to identify who this person is, but this is around 1918. So this is a squadron. This is a squadron of airmen and presumably mechanics or observers, probably observers, commanded by a mixed race officer. So this is the squadron commander in the middle, with his badges of rank and his Sam Brown belt, and he's in charge of this unit, which is an all-white unit apart from him. So again, this really goes against the common narrative. We're not just talking about people serving under, we're talking about mixed race and colored people, the phrase used at the time, and the phrase I used to describe myself, by the way, serving over and above white members of the unit. So very, very striking and contrary to the general sort of perceptions that we have. So this is not, a subservient person from the islands coming up to serve as cannon fodder. Robbie Clark from Jamaica, still in the First World War, made his way from Kingston, and he joined the Royal Flying Corps in 1915 as a pilot. He trained as a pilot, and he came up as a chauffeur, by the way. He was a driver when he came up, but that sort of mechanical knowledge in 1950 would be extremely valuable and would get you places. And so he became a pilot, and he was severely wounded while piloting his aircraft over the Western Front in 1917. He returned to Jamaica, however, and he lived there to a ripe old age in Kingston. And briefly mentioned Walter Tull. So Walter Tull wasn't in the Royal Flying Corps. He was an infantry officer. He was a very successful footballer in England before the war in Britain, and he joined the footballers' battalion of the Middlesex Regiment, and then he served at the Battle of the Somme. He was mentioned in dispatches. That means his superior officers commended him for his gallantry and coolness in combat. He was, as I say, he was an officer, a lieutenant, and he was killed in action on the 25th of March 1918, the last year of the First World War. His body was never found. So it's not just pilots, it's not just mechanics, it's not just sailors. Not to be disparaging towards any of those roles, but it's also infantry officers commanding troops in the frontline trenches. So now we come to 1939. So the First World War was over. People have returned home, been long forgotten. These stories were also forgotten as soon as they happened, really. And this is a picture of my granddad. So this is my father's father, proper sort of Victorian Edwardian headmaster, very strict. I used to have to sit on his knee when he visited when I was 5 or 6, and I had to read. And he wasn't a pleasant experience. It was a test of my reading ability, and my father would be extremely nervous and would be practicing with me for a few weeks before Granddad arrived. very strict. The highest literacy rates, one of the highest literacy rates in the world in the Caribbean in 1939, far higher than certain European countries. Education, education, education. This is the only point on which I agree with Tony Blair. It's literally the only thing he ever said that I agree with. But education, education, education. This picture on the left is, I know it's a little bit small, but it's a very small picture. I couldn't really play that much more. It gets very fuzzy. But this is my grandfather standing behind a class at his school in rural Jamaica. And nobody has shoes on, by the way. It's all barefoot children, but going to class and going to school and learning. And this is a friend of my aunt's at her school, a girls' school in Kingston, a slightly better off school. And this is an aunt of mine who was a nurse. And again, this is proper 1940s nursing. You don't go to see her unless you're actually sick, because she will give you a piece of her mind. Now, at that time, so let's not shy away from the reality of racism, which was, of course, not only common, but actually enshrined in law and policy. So official British policy in 1939 stated that only British-born men of British-born parents of pure European descent could receive commissions in any of His Majesty's services. And this bar was lifted in October 1939, very 3 weeks after war commenced. And that allowed colonial subjects, including black candidates, to officially receive commissions as officers. RAF losses in the following year, in 1940, during the Battle of Britain, very severe. Hundreds of pilots dead. France was lost. Only just won the Battle of Britain, and the decision was made to build a new bomber force, which would involve 1,000 bomber raids, so 1,000 aircraft in one raid on occasion, going to targets, and therefore thousands of new aircrew were required. So there's a major recruitment drive for qualified people. Now, aircrew are skilled individuals. There's nobody in aircrew who is there because of a quota or there because there's an element of desperation. These are engineers, these are mathematicians. To be a navigator, you have to very, very good mathematical skills, trigonometry. The pilots are skilled at that job. So everybody in the air, the gunners, the flight engineers, they're all highly skilled individuals, a highly skilled, highly talented team. And recruitment from the Caribbean for the RAF focuses on the brightest, not the richest, but the brightest. Someone asked a question in the chat before I started about which islands people came from. This is a breakdown. So you can see they came from all across the Caribbean. So from the Lesser Antilles, as they're known, the smaller islands, 34 joined, of whom 16 were killed, so almost half. From the Bahamas, 9 joined, of whom 7 were killed, so 80%. From Barbados, 35, 19 killed. Belize, 12. Guyana, 24. Jamaica, 172. So Jamaica and Trinidad, and to some extent Barbados, were the main contributors. 172, 44 killed. 189 from Trinidad, 45 killed. So just under 500. These numbers have actually changed slightly. I think it's about 500 now. Black and or coloured aircrew. And you can see from this group, this is a group from Barbados, you've got, very dark complexion people, very light complexion people, and people in the middle, multiracial group, all closely knit and joining together and traveling together to train together, to fight together, and in some cases, as with Joseph here, to die together. So 30% of the volunteers would be killed, most of them in action, some in accidents. So why did they fight? So this was also a question in the chat, and it's a question I get asked very, very often. And I asked this question of the surviving volunteers that I interviewed, including my great uncle and others, when I was conducting those interviews. One of the first questions I asked, what was your motivation? And my great uncle, Flight Lieutenant John Blair, said, look, think back to the time, okay? Hitler has conquered Europe. The concentration camp rumors are starting to come out. In the United States, we still have John Crow and verging on slavery in many states. Many people don't think about what would have happened in Jamaica if Hitler had defeated Britain. But we would certainly have returned to slavery. And his reason for saying that is quite logical. If the United States wasn't in the war yet, Okay, so if in 1940, or indeed up to 7 December 1941, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, up until that point in time, if Hitler had defeated Britain, all of Britain's colonies would have gone to Germany, to Nazi Germany. And the Nazis would have been sending their Gestapo representatives and others, and Gauleiters and so on, down to the different islands to take over those islands. They would have been focusing on sugar production and tobacco, and they would have subjugated the local population and sent them straight back to slavery, because that's exactly how they operated. A lot of people don't realize that during the war in Europe, in Germany, 25% of the German workforce was made up of slaves. Okay, 25% of the workforce was slave labor during the Second World War. And so there's no question that had they taken control of the Caribbean and parts of Africa as well, that slavery would have come back full force. So you've got to balance the views you might have, or the views that these people had, because they were not pro-colonial rule. They became involved in the independence movements as soon as the war ended, and some of them were involved before it started. Some of them were even Communist Party members. But they made a choice. They thought, we know British rule and we see what's happening with Nazi rule. We've got to choose between one of these two things. We're going to choose British rule for now, and we're going to make sure that the Nazis don't take over. And then we'll deal with British rule and we will gain our independence. And that's exactly what happened. So it's not that they were pro-empire, but they recognized that this was a lot worse. And listen, look at some of the things that the Nazis were saying. So this is Hitler. Humanitarianism is the expression of stupidity and cowardice. Okay, that sort of thing wasn't coming from the governor in Jamaica. He wasn't saying that sort of thing. Billy Strawn of Jamaica volunteered for exactly those reasons. Here he is on the left. He was a wireless operator and air gunner for his first 30 missions on a Wellington bomber. He survived that tour, which the Wellington was shot down a lot, so it's quite lucky to survive that. And then he volunteered to become a pilot, and he became the first black Lancaster pilot in the RAF, because he'd joined very early. He'd actually made his way to Britain by ship. He'd paid for it himself and went to the Air Ministry to volunteer. Ironically, when he was met, unfortunately, when he was met at the door by a corporal, the corporal told him to piss off and go back to where he came from. But he didn't give up, and he persisted and flew another 15 missions over Europe as a pilot and survived the war. We say Strawn in Jamaica, by the way. I know that people in the UK say Strachan very often, but Billy Strawn is how I pronounce it, because I suspect that's how it was pronounced when by him. Then we get to the West African recruitment. So it wasn't just Caribbean volunteers, but many volunteers from West Africa for military service. Others who, one isn't sure whether they volunteered or felt some sort of pressure to join, particularly infantry soldiers and laborers, but certainly the aircrew were all volunteers. And only about 50 aircrew volunteers were selected from West Africa. This is often explained on the basis that malaria was quite rife, and there was, in fact, a ruling that you had to be malaria-free for 6 months before joining any military force. It didn't seem to stop them recruiting the infantry, though. So I'm not sure about that. But anyway, only 50 aircrew were joined. But here's the most impressive of the lot in my book. This is Johnny Smythe, and I don't say that because Eddie Smythe is on the call. Johnny Smythe features in my book because I have so much respect for him. But but Eddie is on the call, and I'm sure he has a lot more he could tell us. But Johnny Smythe joined the RAF from Sierra Leone. He flew over Europe. His aircraft was shot down, and again, there's a lot of nuance in this story, because there was more than one. Cy Grant was another. There were black aircrew who were shot down over Europe, captured by the Germans, and taken to the same camps that the white aircrew were taken to, and not harmed, and stayed in those camps for 2 years, 3 years in some cases, before being rescued. I'm not sure about Johnny Smythe, but in Cy Grant's case, being rescued by the Red Army, who again didn't harm him and returned him to Britain. So, we have this this view of the past, and sometimes it's well-founded. Lots of extreme things happen, but sometimes there's lots of kindness and generosity, even in places where you didn't expect it. And before we get back to the main story, just an aside, because this is such an important and completely forgotten and ignored dimension of this conflict. and this was the 165,000 West Africans who fought in Burma. About 126,000 of those were Nigerians. They were instrumental in defeating the Japanese army in Burma. These two divisions, or more than two divisions, the 81st, I think the 82nd, and other units were very, very heavily involved in the Arakan campaign and drove the Japanese, back and out of Burma, which was a significant achievement. So when my great uncle is pictured here, bottom right, that's my great uncle in New York. So he's on his way from Jamaica to Moncton in Canada. And again, racism rears its head. He gets on a ship in Kingston Harbor. It's an American merchant ship, and there are hammocks there these are officer volunteers, and they're going to not that actually make any difference, but they're going to go and become officers. The crew, when they realized that they had black passengers, refused to let them use the hammocks and put them in the hold. So they traveled with the cargo. And there were 2 weeks in the ship because it stopped at all sorts of different points in the Caribbean, picking up more volunteers. So you join the RAF as a volunteer, you're going to go into officer training, and you're sitting on a metal floor for 2 weeks, locked in the hold. So racism is very much there. But that doesn't deter them because they know why they're going. They know what they're going to go and do. Here's John Blair in Canada during his training, and black aircrew were training for all sorts of roles, including pilots. And as we'll see, there are fighter pilots who were from the Caribbean and Africa. And he said to me, I never felt that the RAF training and selection process was conducted on anything other than merit. So notwithstanding all the other issues in society, here's an example of a purely white British institution in the space of a year being able to adapt and to accommodate people of all races and make them feel welcome. Now, we've lost some of that subsequently, but it shows that we have the capacity to do that. And once we see each other as human beings and we respect each other, there's really no reason for some of the nonsense that is said and that goes on. Accomplished flyers, RAF official reports stated that there were no suspensions amongst the Caribbean aircrew. The ground and air percentages, their scores, in other words, their exam tests were above average and below average. And they suggest that it fell very much in line with the white training. So the RAF didn't see any difference in terms of qualifications. Interestingly, this group photograph, I believe it's this gentleman here, is E.R. Braithwaite, who wrote the book To Sir With Love. I don't know if anybody recognizes that, but became a film with Sidney Poitier. And then Lulu sung the theme song to Sir With Love. I think it's the same theme song from the film. So this is the author who wrote that. So let's talk about the fighter pilots a little bit. Arthur Wint, very, very famous Jamaican. Arthur Wint, so began as a fighter pilot. He then became a two-time gold medal winner, and then he qualified as a doctor, and he was the doctor for a parish of 19,000 people. He's the only doctor for a parish of 19,000 people in Jamaica when he went back to that country. And he was best mates with my great uncle. My great uncle also ran, and they were both on the RAF track team together. Although my great uncle never got to the level of the Olympics, but he was close to that level. And they were very good friends, and they used to run through the villages around the airbase where they were training. And my great uncle said all the girls would come out of their houses to watch the two of them sprint past. It was quite a thing apparently, and they'd never seen people running that fast before. So they loved that, and then went down the pub, and they could never buy a beer for themselves, not because they weren't allowed in the pub, but because beers were bought for them as long as they stayed in the pub. So they really enjoyed that too. Now we'll come back to the issue of racism because it does rear its head over and over again. But again, it's this mixed experience that people have, the two sides of the coin. Flight Sergeant James Hyde from Trinidad, successful pilot. He reaches the level, as you see, Flight Sergeant. That's the squadron mascot he's with there, the dog. Sadly killed over Nijmegen in Holland in 1944. If anybody's familiar with that dimension of history, this is during the Bridge Too Far episode when the paratroopers were dropped on the various bridges to try and get into northern Germany and failed at Arnhem on the last bridge. Failed to capture the bridge, and there was a lot of aerial activity overhead while that was happening. This is where he was killed. So very sad. Weeks and Joseph. So Joseph on the right from Trinidad, shot down and killed over Europe. Flight Sergeant Weeks on the left from Barbados survived the war, both of them Spitfire pilots. Now, this is a really interesting picture. So, Flight Lieutenant Vincent Bunting, who survived the war, was Jamaican, and he's shown here in his flight gear. He's just come out of an aircraft that is on a mission, flew over Europe, 1944, 1945, and he's talking to a South African ace. So an ace is anybody who shot down 4 or more enemy aircraft. I believe the number is 4. Sailor Milan is a very famous ace, shot down a lot of enemy aircraft. South African, very feisty, tough fighter. He's engaging here with, as a South African, he's engaging here with a black man in the mid-1940s, early 1940s. Milan actually returns home and joins the African National Congress and becomes a leading voice in the fight against apartheid. And I always look at this quick picture and wonder whether part of his reason for doing that was his experience working, with a black airman and returning home and thinking, apartheid is simply wrong. But anyway, he becomes a major champion in Mandela's organization. Flight Lieutenant Kelsick, I had a photograph of him, couldn't track it down. I couldn't find anything on the internet, but he's another Caribbean flyer who flew Typhoons over Europe. So a Typhoon is a fighter bomber. So it's both air to air and air to ground. So striking at German convoys, destroying tanks, destroying trucks, and generally causing havoc. So he was there at low level, 100, 150 feet above the ground, dodging telephone poles in some cases. In fact, one of his Caribbean colleagues flew into a telephone pole and was killed. So that's how low they were. Now, it wasn't only aircrew. In addition to the almost 500 aircrew, there were 5,000 Caribbean ground crew personnel. And they trained at Filey, RAF Filey in Yorkshire, which is the location of Butlins. So it was the Butlins holiday camp that was handed over to the government very cleverly by Mr. Butlin, if that was his name. And then it was expanded significantly by the Royal Air Force during the war and then handed back to him at no additional charge. So he inherited this massive new complex. And here are ground crew arriving by ship. I look at that and it reminds me of a picture of a slave ship, and I understand why people have concerns and reservations. But this is my boss. So Carl Chantrell was my boss at the Jamaica Telephone Company when I worked there. I was the head of fraud and security for the Jamaica Telephone Company, now I think called Lime or something, or Orange, I can't remember. And he was the president of the company, and because he was in signals in the RAF, so he'd stayed in signals, and he'd gone all the way through the president of the Jamaica Telephone Company, where I worked for him. And it's the RAF that gave him that opportunity. The RAF gave him that skill set, and his Second World War experience in signals was what would last him right through the rest of his career and buy him a lovely house in the hills above Kingston. So again, yes, there's racism. Yes, there are questions to be asked, but a lot of people benefited from this in many, many different dimensions. Let's not forget the female volunteers. So there were an unknown, we don't know exactly how many there were, but certainly in the dozens of Caribbean women, and also black women born in the UK. So Lillian Bader, who was the first black woman to serve in regular British forces, was actually born in the UK, so she didn't travel from the Caribbean. But we believe she's of Caribbean origin or roots, heritage. And she worked in a technical capacity in a lab, in a workshop. Sonia Thompson from Jamaica was another, and you can see a group here of ladies from the Caribbean of various hues. So all in the UK, all serving during the war. And if you're in the UK during the war, you're at risk. I think the number, if I'm not wrong, is 80,000 civilians died in the UK during the war from bombing. And if you're on an air base, then you're very much ground zero, and people died on air bases on a regular basis, either because of bombing or because of accidents on the air base. Many of the women were involved in loading bombs onto aircraft, and it wasn't uncommon for bombs to go off while the aircraft were being loaded and to obliterate the aircraft and everybody working around it. So there's danger in all sorts of dimensions during wartime. Back to the question of racism, because it's a big question and it crops up every time you talk to somebody about this. So Billy Strawn said, when you arrived anywhere as the first black man, you were treated like a teddy bear. You were loved and feted. Two they coped with is when the three or more arrived that racism got sharp. So I think that would probably resonate with a lot of people. And to a certain extent, you can understand why someone in a Yorkshire village might start to get a little bit nervous in 1940 something when there are 4 black people in the pub. But that's not to excuse it, but I think you can understand the psychology. And so, I don't think it's actually that different to today. I think that it's not that hard to get into the heads of people at that time on both sides of that fence. There's another incident that occurred that's not in my slides that I mentioned, which is Johnny Banks, who was a mosquito navigator. And he described how when he first walked in, from Jamaica, when he first walked into the officers' mess, the bar, where people were standing around drinking and chatting, he walked up to the bar and everybody in his vicinity moved away from him and just left him standing by himself. And that's a picture you can imagine in your minds. But at that point, the wing commander just shouted out, "All of you lot, get back to the bar. I'll have none of that in my mess." So there was that one person in a senior position who just cut that short and just knocked that on the head as soon as he saw it. And it doesn't mean that people were happy to have Johnny Banks there, but over time they accepted him and he did very well and survived the war. I mentioned Cy Grant briefly. Cy Grant was a navigator from Guyana. He became a BBC television personality after the war. He was the voice of, I think, Captain Green or Captain Black in the whatever that thing's called with the puppets in the 1960s. And he said that even amidst the deafening drone of scores of other aircraft, the muffled explosions below, the glow of the target area, we'll come back to that glow in a minute, the flak, the sweeping searchlights and sudden bumps as aircraft rode the frenzied skies, I never questioned what I was doing there. I never questioned what I was doing there. It was dangerous. 1,000 aircraft in a stream of bombers in the dark, fog and cloud and ice and rain, and night fighters prowling like sharks looking for anybody who's out of the bomber stream who's not protected by the other. Yes, Captain Scarlet, thank you. He was Captain Green and Captain Scarlet. Night fighters prowling, trying to shoot down aircraft, flying below them, equipped with radar, shooting up into the stomach of the aircraft, into the bomb bay, detonating the explosives in many cases. The chance of getting out of a the chance of getting out of a Lancaster alive if it was shot down was 1 in 10. Only 1 in 10 crew members successfully parachuted to safety during World War II from a Lancaster. And in fact, the casualties were so heavy. On some occasions, 4 or 5% of the force in a single night. Okay, they were so heavy that these German aircrew, when they were trying to find the bombers, would actually follow the line of burning aircraft on the ground. And the radar would take them to a general area, but that line of burning planes falling from the sky or burning on the ground was what really led them to where the bombers were at that point. So think about that for a moment. This is Europe. This is where we live. This is landing in the UK, taking off from the UK when your parents or grandparents were alive. And I talked about those odds already. Here is Lincoln Lynch. So Lincoln Lynch is a tail gunner. So we have Black Caribbean tail gunners. And on his first mission, Lincoln shot down a Messerschmitt night fighter, 2-engine night fighter. You saw it in the previous slide as well, or a couple of slides. But what he did was he shot the engine out, and then he held fire while he allowed the crew to parachute to safety. And then the aircraft was flying without any crew in it. He finished shooting it down at that point. He was awarded the DFM. He actually became an officer later on. I think he became a flight lieutenant. So that's courage. Sitting in the tail of a heavy bomber in the dark in World War II, with no vision aids, it's just your eyeball, the enemy's eyeballs. They're trying to find you to blow you out of the sky. And they're doing that every night. So you're doing 30 missions and then another 20. Okay, and every night for several hours, you're sat in darkness, knowing that there are people out there, highly trained, highly experienced. Some of the German pilots had shot down 150 aircraft by the time they went hunting for Lincoln Lynch. And he knew that, and he had to sit there and wait in silence and look for them. Terrifying to think about, terrifying to experience. I know I couldn't do it. 30% were killed in action. 1/3. This is Sergeant Leslie Gilks of Trinidad, and he sat beside Sergeant Dickinson from Canada. They're chatting. This is the night of the mission. This is the preparation for the mission, and on that night, Gilks dies. So almost immediately, within hours of this photograph being taken, this is his last day with us on Earth. And he dies over the North Sea, with the entire crew dies, and his body is never found. Dickinson, sitting next to him, was traveling in another aircraft, and he survived the war and went back to Canada. So that's all there is, sometimes between life and death. Different plane, a different few minutes in the air. Now let's talk about the glow of the fires. Racism is actually only one of my thoughts, concerns, worries when I look at this subject. Those bombs that were being dropped literally turned German cities and cities elsewhere into places that were like the surface of the sun, with temperatures below ground of 1,400 degrees Celsius, and on the surface 1,600 degrees Celsius or even higher, sending steam into cellars and killing people with hot steam from water pipes nearby, incinerating whole populations, men, women, and children, babies, transformed into ashes. War is an evil, evil thing, and I speak as someone who's worn a uniform. Do not go to war unless you have no choice. German civilian deaths. So the US Strategic Bombing Survey estimated that during the war, 305,000 civilians were killed. Other sources say 600,000, and others pointing out that 300,000 died in Dresden alone during one series of raids. So the numbers aren't known, which is the nature of that kind of attack. You can't count numbers; most would have just disappeared. But certainly lots, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was higher than 600,000. A huge loss of civilian life, and we need to ponder that as well. We can't gloss over that. But this was total war. This is Goebbels, Joseph Goebbels, and he called for total war, as you'll see. I don't call it the Second World War. I call it the Great War. And of course, the First War was the Great War, but I call it the Great War against fascism and genocide, because the term Second World War allows us to forget why we were fighting. And we were fighting the most evil regime and the greatest threat to humanity ever seen. No other global calamity, no other global crisis or conflict has involved the deliberate slaughter of entire nations based on their ethnicity. This is the only time in history that a global conflict has had that dimension to it. Yes, there have been localized events of terrible events, but this was a global threat. And these people, the Nazis, I'm not talking about Germans, I'm talking about Nazis. The Nazis were intent on taking over a significant part of the planet and carrying out genocide across that entire region. And they would have continued after the war. They had it in for the Slavs as well. It wasn't just Jews, Gypsies, and perhaps some black people. Goebbels, at a speech in 1943, asked the people, do you want total war? If necessary, do you want a war more total and radical than anything we can even imagine today? And the people say yes. And that's what he got. So, I feel very, very deeply for the victims on all sides of that war. But this was a war brought on Germany by its leadership. And that's the lesson we have to learn. We do not allow leaders like that to emerge. And when we sense them coming, we stop them, because this is where they'll take us. I talked about prisoners of war. So here's Johnny Smythe, Stalag Luft 1. Here's Cy Grant, who's in Stalag Luft 3. He spent 2 years there. And they were treated pretty much as everyone else was treated. In fact, Cy Grant, when he arrived, To have a slide, yeah. So Sagram, when he arrived, he'd been pictured in the local newspaper, so he was a little bit of a celebrity because the German press couldn't figure out what he was. So they called him an RAF airman of undefined race or unknown race. He actually got on very well with the camp commandant because Grant was from British Guiana at the time, or Guyana today, and the commandant had actually been to Guyana and loved Guyana, and so he met Cy Grant at the gate, and he instructed two of his officers to make sure that he was well treated, and he was well treated by almost everyone throughout the period, except by another prisoner who insisted on calling him the N-word for the next 2 years. Just couldn't deal with the concept of a black airman or a black officer. Grant was a flight lieutenant. Rescued by the Red Army in April and May 1945, tanks of the Soviet Red Army broke into central Germany and drove through the fence. And Grant talked about the women soldiers riding the tanks. So there were women Soviet soldiers who, in many cases, were taking revenge for the men they'd lost earlier in the war. They too had joined the army. One of the most effective Soviet snipers was a woman who killed 495 of the enemy and survived the war. Ludmila, I'm going to say Pavlichenko, that may be wrong. So he met these women riding the tanks, and he said that they exuded violence. He said that they just gave off a smell of violence, and they were out to revenge themselves or to avenge themselves on the German people. So a terrible time for all those in Germany who had not fought in the East, who are now going to pay that price. And we're coming to the end now. We've got 80 missions. Ulrich Cross. He is the most highly decorated of the Caribbean airmen. He's from Trinidad. He flew 80 missions over Europe. After doing his for the obligatory 20, 30, and then 20, so 50 that you had to do, he volunteered for another 30 and did that. He later became a High Court and then Court of Appeal judge in Trinidad. He was also very, very active in the independence movements in Africa. There's a film about him, actually, that tells that story. And again, very good example of someone who's done this. They fought for the empire, but they fought for freedom in order to then go and fight for independence. And very, very active in the independence movement. My great uncle was selected for the Pathfinder force. He, on completion of his first 30 mission tour, the Pathfinder is the elite force that goes first to the target and marks the target for everybody else. He was still in training when the war ended, but he stayed in the RAF until 1963, and he was the navigator on the Comet, so that the jet, the highly modern, very modern jet aircraft that only the best crews would be selected for. He was the navigator on that aircraft. So he's not just someone who's filling in during the war period. He's a highly skilled navigator and operates a very, very sophisticated plane many years after the war's ended. Here's Princess Elizabeth with her parents, the King and Queen, reviewing Caribbean servicemen. So very, very much aware of that contribution. Notwithstanding that awareness, the fact of that awareness, our contribution is then lost and brushed under the carpet. Not by her, but by society. Here's Arthur Wint and Norma Wint on the day of their wedding at the end of the war. And this one's particularly interesting. This is Flying Officer Errol Walton Barrows. This is his tombstone as he wanted it to be inscribed. Navigator, Royal Air Force, World War II, and Prime Minister of Barbados. Which shows you how proud he was. Even though he'd gone back, been involved in the independence movement, become the Prime Minister of his independent nation, the first thing he wanted on his tombstone was his rank and his Royal Air Force service. And the last word, I give the last word to Johnny Banks, who I mentioned earlier, who's seated here. Here's my great uncle. This is 1995, the victory over Japan Day celebration in London, which they attended. Here's Johnny Banks, navigator on a Mosquito. I didn't go to fight for king and country. I didn't. I went to fight for freedom. These are the words he said to me. For Jamaica, and for all the little countries of the world that would otherwise be controlled by bullies. And that is the example that we have to follow, because in the world we live in today, if we take our eyes off the ball, we will be ruled by bullies. And it's these people that we have to remember, and these principles that we have to live up to and learn about. And that's why this story is so important, because these people risked literally everything So thank you very much for your attention. I haven't been able to look at the questions or comments as I've been talking, but I'll have a quick look over here. And I think Harry's going to prompt me anyway. And thanks to Harry for mentioning my book. I really don't pitch stuff when I'm doing presentations, but if you are interested, the book's called Caribbean Volunteers at War, and it's available from Amazon or preferably Pen and Sword Publishers, because it doesn't affect. I don't earn anything from this book. It's pittance, but Pen and Sword, they're the publishers, and Amazon take a big cut. So I prefer Pen and Sword. Got your money than Amazon. So that is it from me, Harry. I don't know if you have any questions for me.
I did. I really enjoyed the talk, Mark. I'm going to give you a quick moment to catch your breath whilst I tell our audience about some of our upcoming lectures, and then we'll go into the Q&A. And it's a good opportunity for our audience as well to use the ask a question function as I'm doing this, to put any questions they want to put to you, and I'll interrogate you on the detail. But as I said, I really enjoyed the talk. We've got a whole series of talks coming up in the next 6 weeks. And next week, we are joined by Katie Brown, who will talk about the end of gentlemanly warfare and the use of gendered language in describing the strategic bombing offensive. That's at 6 p.m. on Thursday. And then we go to Lancaster in 3 weeks' time, I believe, where we're going onto the road, Lancaster University. Then we go to Codsford at the museum, then up to Wolverhampton University, and then we have a virtual lecture. And those take in a whole realm of subjects, from air power through to the First World War. And you're very welcome to join us for all of them. They will all be on our Crowdcast channel, which you can find at the RAF Museum at the top, with all the dates and the means of joining. But Mark, I really enjoyed the talk, and I thought it was very important to end as you did, reflecting on the sacrifice that all of these individuals made, and the world which we want to see today in terms of the leaders we allow to step forward, and not having people who want to push the sort of bullying and politics of fascism re-emerge in our world, which I do think is a danger. And I think when we look at sacrifices made in previous wars, we have to ask, what are we doing to uphold that sacrifice? I think that's a really important point you make. In terms of how many of these volunteers who came both from the Caribbean and West African areas, how many of them who were going forward to fight do you feel were particularly politically aware? So I think there's a growing sense that this is more of a theme than has previously been recognized.
A significant proportion of them. You've got Johnny Smythe, very, very politically aware. In fact, Eddie will correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Johnny described himself as a communist. And you've got Michael Manley, who is one of the volunteers, who becomes Prime Minister of Jamaica. Earl Barrow, of course, we talked about. Dudley Thompson, who becomes the Minister of National Security in independent Jamaica, who is a fighter pilot. Not all of them, but I'll talk about Ulrich Cross, of course, working very, very closely with independence movements in West Africa. You've got a significant percentage of them going into politics itself. And then you've got others who go into law and medicine. Some of those in law become, active in defending those who would otherwise fall victim of colonial oppression. And there's no question in my mind that these are liberal, modern, intelligent, and highly educated people who do not perceive anything other than, or do not envision anything other than an independent future. But they see this threat on the horizon, and they take a short step backwards in order to fight that.
Okay, brilliant. I want to put as many questions from our audience as I can to you. I know you've answered some of them with comments, so I shall try and put the new ones first. So this one's from Jamie, and he I hope asks, was civilian racism instances against these volunteers any part of British or American culture, or was it influenced by Jim Crow from the USA?
So these things are always complex. You could ask the same question today. So the American forces who arrived in Britain after 1941, so in 1942-43, were actually really shocked. They were troubled deeply by what they saw when they saw black, military personnel and white English women together, sometimes married, sometimes in the boyfriend-girlfriend relationship, and in the pubs, in the clubs, and just basically operating as if they were human beings. Okay, and there was a big push from the American military to suppress that and to persuade the British not to allow that. And there were clashes. There were even clashes in the street at one point, fights, and all sorts of things took place. They were very, very unpleasant. But so although you have racism in British society, and you've always had racism in British society, but it's never been the kind of racism that you would experience even today in parts of the US, or certainly then in many US states, which I won't name, but you know what they are. So I think it's a different thing. And bear in mind that we never had slavery, that in a big way in the UK. Slavery was somewhere else. That the anti-slavery movement, although it was powered in large part by rebellions overseas, was also powered in large part by white British people like Wilberforce agitating against slavery in Parliament, and also that we never had a civil war here that was about slavery. And so there's no defeated group in British society who feels resentment against black people because they lost a war over slavery. And so that makes America a much more complicated place when it comes to race than Britain.
Yeah, there's a video I'm sure you've seen of it, preparing American airmen for service in the UK. So various aspects, what you can do in a pub, what you can't. And one of them is explicitly recognizing that they will encounter a non-segregated society. Okay.
Yeah, a big shock for many of them.
So we've got a question from Martin Yem, who says the issue of segregation was raised in the TV series Foyle's War, and how we weren't doing it as the US wanted. Okay, it's a comment. Thank you very much. So it's I think we've touched on this before, and you've answered it briefly in the comments, but I think it'd be good to expand on it slightly further. It's widely known that many Caribbean service personnel came to the UK with the hope of finding work to financially support their families in their home countries. Why do you believe the men joined the armed forces to protect a country that enslaved and displaced them? That's from Jennifer Burnett.
Yeah, and let me make it clear to Jennifer and others. So my personal history is that I'm the product of a slave master who had 16 mixed-race children through force with 3 slave girls. The first of each of those slave girls, the first time they became pregnant was at the age of 12. Okay, so I totally understand the point of view, and I'm the product, literally, of a rape a few generations ago. Okay, but I still believe, and I also accept that a lot of people would have come to earn money. A lot of people would have come to earn money. But I'm focused here on the aircrew. I'm focused on educated professionals who didn't need to come to earn money, who were well established in their own society, who were actually, although in many cases dark skinned, they were actually in the middle and upper middle class in the Caribbean. And so they came for other reasons. I'm sure there were some who came for adventure. There may have been some who came to earn money. It may have been some who came to be educated, but they didn't need to. They didn't have that economic pressure to come. And so primarily it was about doing the right thing, and I think their primary motives were political and societal, and the defense against fascism. They wanted to fight fascism. That was their primary driver. And I don't suggest that applied to everybody, or even to a majority, but I'm talking about the airmen.
Yeah, I thought the point about the West African Regiment, I'd love to have a lecture in the future in our series about this, because I think the story of how they're involved in the Arakan campaign and how closely they cooperate with the RAF and vice versa, a really interesting story. Yeah. There seemed to be a very close relationship which developed between the units.
Yeah. I suspect it's a very different story as well. I suspect many of them, from my experience of being in the infantry, I suspect many of them were just told to go where they went. They didn't have any particular motivation other than obeying orders.
Okay, we've got a question here from Jez Holmes. He says, it's a brilliant and inspiring talk, Mark. Thank you very much. My question is, how do we make the modern Royal Air Force a more inspiring career choice from those from a BAME background?
Okay, so Jez, I know Jez quite well. Jez actually wrote the foreword to my book. So hi, Jez. Glad you're here. I'm not sure there's a simple answer. And I'm not an expert on that sort of matter either, but I can only speak to my experience. And my experience was that as a child, I wanted to join a military organization because of the stories I read. Okay, so I grew up reading about Douglas Bader, and I read all the comics, and there was a lot of literature that had role models, rightly or wrongly. You could dispute whether those are good role models, but they had role models that appealed to me, and I wanted to be one of them. And I think until we have a large number of historically accurate and believable role models for people, and they don't have to be military people. In any sort of field, people will not be drawn into those professions. So if they look at a profession and see it as an all-white elitist profession, and they know that they're not white, and they know they're not in the elite, they're unlikely to apply. You have to be extremely brave to apply in those circumstances. So for me, it's about storytelling. It's about role models. It's about, but not over the top. Not over the top. I saw an example in the film 1917 that really disturbed me, where every time the camera panned, there was a black soldier in the front line in World War One. Now we know there were some black soldiers, but there weren't that many. So put one in, don't put 15 in. So it's got to be believable and credible. You don't want people leaving saying, "Ah, that was annoying me." It's a very fine balance, but we need to get that into our culture and tell some of these stories, and just include people who were there in the stories. It takes decades. It's going to take decades, sadly.
It's important. I think you're right. So we've got a question from Garfield Wesley Hall, and he says, "Hi Mark, do you know about Akin Shenbanjo? Apologies if I've mispronounced that. The son of a Nigerian prince who had a Halifax bomber named after him."
The Black Prince. The Black Prince. Yeah. The bomber was named the Black Prince. Yeah, yes, I do know about him. He's in the book. His photograph is on my desktop, but with only 50 minutes to present, I'm afraid I had to miss some people out. But he's a very, very, very prominent figure. I think probably the reason I missed him out was he was the son of a prince, and I wanted to focus. That's a whole other discussion there, right? So I wanted to focus on the people who were the son of school teachers and the sons of nurses, and because that they represent the majority, and their motivations might be different than the son of a prince. So that's the only reason I didn't mention it. But I'm well aware of it.
I think it's fascinating. Firstly, it shows the depth of experience here, which it's not these isolated examples, which I think it's sometimes portrayed as being. Really is a proper legacy of service. But it also touches onto this idea of class as well. You can talk about sort of the sons of school teachers, but there does seem to be this intersection between class and race, which has a really fascinating role within the British military as a whole in this period. And that seems to then change post-war. We create this different myth in British society. But before sort of 1939, class seems to have a very big role in deciding who is acceptable and who isn't. Do you feel that's true?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just in relation to black people. 20% of the RAF at some points during World War II was Polish. You hear nothing of them. Okay. On some days during the Battle of Britain, 80% of fighter pilots were Polish or Czech. Okay. There were French. There were South Africans, I mentioned, Australians, Indians, large numbers of Indians, Asian people, some people from Pacific Islands served, and many, many others. And we as soon as 1945 comes, we basically forget about all of those people and just focus on the stereotypical, British tally-ho chap. And I suppose it's natural in any culture to do that, but I think we've lost something. And given that those people are still present in society and are getting a lot of stick today, now's the moment to remember their contribution too, and to recognize that we wouldn't have a country if it wasn't for all those foreigners who came in and helped.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we've got a question from Alan. I wonder if you're able to answer this, which is he wanted to check whether the US Army, when it introduced multiple choice questions, revealed that black soldiers from northern states were better educated as a whole than southern whites.
Than southern whites. Okay, look, I don't know the answer to that, and it's not something I would be qualified to respond to authoritatively. But from the little that I do know about, because I read a lot about America and I'm interested in the Civil War and so on, and I've been to America many, many times. If that was proven to be true, it wouldn't surprise but it would be a generalization. And obviously, there are some very well-educated people from the South who are white, just as there are probably some very badly educated white people in the North. So you're not going to find that it's true across the board. But it wouldn't surprise me if that statistically there was some merit to that statement. But I don't know, so I'm not supporting the statement. I'm just saying it doesn't. I don't see it and go, "Oh, that can't be true."
Yeah, I don't know either. I have a feeling it might refer specifically to the Tuskegee Airmen, the stat which you've seen, Alan, because I think that might be in one of the books. And in which case, I think that would probably be true. That specific group.
Yeah.
Okay. So to our audience, if we've got more questions, do keep them coming. This one's from Elizabeth Smith. She says she'd really love to research the 6 Caribbean aircrew who are buried at Stonefall Cemetery in Harrogate, and she wonders, based on your research, what do you feel the best way forward is?
Okay, so the person who's going to be able to answer that question is called, and I know she'll be happy for me to give her name here. In fact, Harry, I suggest that what we'll do is we'll contact her, and then you can send it out afterwards. But I'm going to suggest, Elizabeth, a person who's very, very well versed on Filey and all the black aircrew who were there, or black ground crew who were there, and I'm going to see if Harry can get that name to you as an email address as well. I'll send it out. I don't know who else, I don't want to say it in public call because she might not want to do that, but I suspect she'd be happy to help.
Very sensible thinking, Mark. You can email artcollections@rafmuseum.org, and we will try and help you answer that. And my colleagues will be delighted, but I've given out their contact details.
Johnson Bihari, is that the winner of the Victoria Cross?
I'm not entirely sure. I did see Johnson Bihari's name mentioned. I wondered what the context was.
Was it mentioning the name? Oh, so it's mentioning the name, not it's not him. Okay, I thought he was on the call. So sorry to sound disappointed, Daph. Daph has mentioned Johnson Bihari. I'm not sure what he was getting at, but just mentioning someone who, of
the notable stories, role models.
Yeah, role model. Yeah. So great role model. Absolutely, carrying people from burning vehicles under fire.
Yeah. So Stephanie Payne has asked, and I know you've given a quick comment to this. How were the Black Airmen supported financially and emotionally?
So financially, there was they were treated exactly like any other member of the RAF, the same pay rates. They weren't segregated. I didn't make this point in the presentation, but the crews were integrated. So it wasn't as if you had a plane full of black people flying all by themselves. You have a black navigator in this one with a Canadian, an Irishman, a Scotsman, and then over there a black gunner with another crew of European, British airmen. So it was very, very integrated, same pay rates. And no distinction made there. Emotional support, nobody got emotional support, regardless of their background. In that era, you just did it, and if you couldn't do it, a certain degree of kindness had started to develop in military circles. So if you couldn't do it, they would just very quietly move you to another area. If you'd done really, really well, they might just move you to training. But yeah, the whole concept of psychological damage and that still wasn't a thing. Really, in those days, it was a pat on the shoulder and stiff upper lip, carry on, chap. So,
okay, brilliant. So we've still got time for some more questions if our audience want to keep them in. I know we've got a comment from. Sorry, you've answered this one. It's about Eddie Smythe, and I've got to say Eddie Smythe's a very inspiring figure, and I think the range of individuals who serve in the RAF from Caribbean and West African backgrounds who have such a dynamic history after the war as well is really remarkable. And I wonder whether or not that education, which you talked about earlier, was a big factor in that. How much is this the same as the RAF in Britain being able to select the very best in a way, being applied both into the Caribbean and West Africa? And that these are very well educated, very bright service personnel, and the RAF can pick and choose, and it takes the very best that it can.
So it's a question about education and how that came about. So again, nuance is the key word throughout this whole story. Okay, so the colonial system, was inherently rapacious and did not serve most colonial subjects well. It had originated in either slavery or near slavery for many populations. But by the 1930s, that period, of course, was over, and there was a large element within some aspects of the colonial infrastructure of building infrastructure in countries, of building schools and hospitals, of educating local populations to a standard that matched the standard in England, in Britain. And school inspectors would be sent out to the Caribbean islands, for example, to visit every school on a regular basis and ensure that lessons being taught on a slate, in a single classroom with people of all ages, but corresponded to the standards that were expected. And let's remember that in many English villages, schools looked like that as well at that point in time. So I think Britain's colonial history, you can look at it in many different ways, many different directions, but it did do some good things, and one of the good things it did was to extend education to people who otherwise would not have had it. And that gave them opportunities, and that equipped them to become independent, to seize their independence when the time came. And we shouldn't forget that fact.
Yeah, okay. Well, hopefully a question should come in. Okay, it's from Martin, who says that this is sort of the contributions need to be more widely shared. It's a great opportunity, Martin, for me to tell you that on the 20th of November, the RAF Museum is hosting a workshop entitled Freedom Fighters, which is designed to look at the motivations of people who joined the Royal Air Force from different areas of the world, where many of them were opposed to British rule. That includes, of course, the Caribbean, Ireland, India, across the world. So it's open to the public, it's free, starts at 10:30 on Saturday. Details are on our website, and I will post a link, but you're all very welcome to come and join us. I think the point you make about independence as well, Errol Barrow, an amazing figure, and I think it chimes in with some of the other things you talked about when his speech, Look in the Mirror, where he talks about people needing to reflect on themselves and the kind of life that they want and lead forward. I think he's a remarkable individual. And I think when we talk about the influence of Caribbean personnel within the RAF, it's not just this linear, they went and flew and took part in operations. The wider effect they had in the culture would be fascinating to study, I think. It must have had a two-way process, because they are a very, very well-educated and bright group of individuals. And again, don't want to generalize, it's a mix. Some people came simply because they seemed to wanted to fly. And I think reflecting on those different motivations and how it was a two-way process is something we need to do more of going forward. I think your book's very good at drawing out the complexities. So I think if we just end, I think unless we're going to get any more questions, we've suddenly had a splurge of questions, Mark. This is excellent. I was a bit worried we're having to wrap up. So this is from Charles. He said, I was under the impression that all the airmen from the West Indies that volunteered for the aircrew were trained in Canada. Is that correct?
So those that volunteered during the recruitment drive in the West Indies were, as far as I know, all trained in Canada. They were taken to Canada for training. But there are people like Billy Strawn who made their own way to Britain much earlier, so in 1940, literally as soon as Dunkirk had occurred. Churchill's speech triggered that, and they were sometimes trained in the UK. There were a lot of British, white British RAF crew who were trained in Canada as well, because it wasn't safe to do training flights over much of the UK at that stage. So yes, so they trained in Canada with other British aircrew.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, let's try and crack through these questions. So my uncle served in the RAF. This is from Steve Sinclair. He says he joined from Jamaica, but I've no record of his service. His name was Raphael Sinclair. Where do I start to trace his service?
Okay, if you just email me, Raphael, or my email is in the chat somewhere, and it was on his last slide. Harry can also send it out. Feel free, Harry. I can introduce you to perhaps to Peter Devitt, who has a lot of information. And I'll ask you a few questions first, and then they'll give us an idea of where we need to go. There's no guarantees. It is quite difficult. Audrey, who I mentioned, may have a list as well, because she focuses on ground crew. So we can certainly do a search. So just drop me an email.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think your email address was in one of the previous questions, which has been answered as well. So that'll be available. Yeah. That'll be available afterwards as a comment, so you'll be able to find it. Okay, so this is from Karen. She says, what would you say are the lessons that we can learn from these inspiring individuals that can be passed on to children today?
Okay, a couple of lessons. I wish we were beyond the time in history where we needed to even say that black people can do this. I wish we were, but there are still people who don't get that. So I suppose that's one message. But for me, the most important message is that there is a beast out there. There is a beast out there that lives in the hearts of many that will eat us. And when we see it, or when we sense it, we have to stand up and fight, even if that means fighting, with weapons, fighting physically. Because if we don't, the fate of the Jews and the fate of the Gypsies and the fate of the Polish people is the fate that awaits all of us. That's my message.
Okay. So this is from Beth. And she says, is there a trend to dismiss or perhaps to not agree with the involvement of West African and Caribbean troops by their countrymen either at the time or today because of the reason they were fighting within the colonizer army, she says. And this question comes from somebody who's Irish, she says, and the fact that any involvement that Irish personnel had in British affairs was definitely a dividing point.
Absolutely. And when many of these aircrew volunteers returned to the respective islands they'd come from, many of them didn't really talk much about their service. It wasn't that they were ashamed of their service, but they recognized that, particularly in the climate of the 60s independence movements and the 1970s Black Power movement in the States, which manifested itself in the Caribbean as well, it just wasn't, it wasn't going to get them very far if they talked about being in the RAF. It just wasn't a thing to talk about. And so they kept fairly quiet about that. And then there's, the younger generation, that just doesn't understand the threat. Come back to that threat. So if you don't understand that threat, if you don't know your history, and you don't understand what Nazism meant for your society, you're never going to understand anybody who volunteered to fight. And it's that lack of awareness of history and that lack of understanding that really, for me, is the most fundamental issue.
Yeah. And in terms of this is from Iamidi Thomas. She says the service personnel in general, there's a reluctance to talk about their service from the Second World War often. Is that true equally for Caribbean personnel? Are they reluctant to talk about what they went through?
They are, and when they do talk, I think they talk, the people I interviewed, I think they talk to me in large part because I had done military service myself, so they thought I'd understand certain things. They all talked about the bombing. The bombing bothered them. They talked about trying to do their best. They talked about us having no other weapon that we could use, and they felt no alternative, but it bothered them. And there's the horror that you experience, and then there's the horror that you imagine. And sometimes the latter is worse. And so I think that's a big part of it, not really wanting to necessarily be too closely associated with those events.
Yeah, I wonder, you mentioned, I think it's your great uncle, Blair, who says that he never felt that the RAF training and selection process was conducted on anything but merit. Whenever I speak to RAF officers who serve today, I sort of detect that there's always a reluctance to talk about the force in anything other than positive terms. And that's true of veterans as well. And do you feel that's true here as well? Or do you think that's the absolute reflection? Do you know what I mean? That sort of, there's a stoicism, but I won't speak badly about my force. Or is this the way that it was?
I think that I'm sure you can find some individuals who speak badly, but I didn't meet any. I think that it's genuine. I think that there's genuine pride, a genuine feeling of having belonged and having been part of something really important, something really big, and having changed world history for the better. There's no question in my mind that the defeat of Nazi Germany was a change for the better in terms of the direction of world history. So and they knew that they'd achieved that. They'd been one of the primary weapons used to achieve that, and they would have felt that confidence and pride, even if they kept it quiet.
Okay, we've had one question come in from Juliet. I was going to wrap up at that point because I thought it would have been a lovely moment to end, but Juliet's asked about more details about the Pathfinder Force, and I think that's a really nice area to go into as well.
Okay, so the Pathfinders, well, it's the end of his career, so it may also be an appropriate wrap up. But the Pathfinders, as you may know, Juliet, were the force that went first to the target. So what the Pathfinders needed to do was to be very, very accurate in their navigation, because if they made a mistake, all the other bombs would drop on the markers that they had left. So they'd drop aerial flares and flares on the ground and start fires. So the other bombers could just drop bombs on top of that. So if the Pathfinders got that wrong, it could result in the wrong place being bombed. So instead of bombing a factory, you might bomb a town full of innocent people. So very, very important function, and it required the highest level of skill. So Uncle John, being a navigator in the Pathfinders, navigation was the key here. Was literally, the man or one of the people who had to make sure that the 1,000 bombers coming behind him were dropping their bombs on the right spot. That's a huge responsibility. Now, he didn't actually fly operationally because he was still training when the war ended, but that's the role he was being trained for. So that tells you that this is, as I said, this is not cannon fodder. This is a highly skilled professional being given one of the most important roles you could possibly have. It's hard to imagine a more significant job anywhere than leading a Pathfinder Air Force at the front of 1,000 RAF bombers.
Okay, brilliant. I think we're going to call it there. I should say to everyone, we're going to post links in the chat for all of the different things we've mentioned, our lecture series, the workshop, but also Mark's book, because it's highly valuable and well worth ordering.
Can I just? Someone's asked about if you're seeing a price of 164 for a hardback copy, that's someone ripping you off. Don't buy that. Go to Pen and Sword. It's a paper, but it's a soft copy, softback. Okay, don't buy the hardback from anybody. That's somebody ripping you off. Go to Pen and Sword. I can't remember the price, but it's nothing like that. It's a normal price for a normal book. Okay.
Yeah, the link is in the chat.
Don't buy that from Amazon.
But yeah, I just want to finish by thanking everyone for joining us tonight, and thanking you, Mark, for what was for an excellent talk. I really enjoyed it. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Harry. It's been a pleasure.
Good night.